Hello, and welcome to Sinister, where we tell you 3 dark and interesting stories a week. If you want to know more about the format of the show, you can check out the video trailer on this channel's homepage. If you like the show, make sure to hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you always know when a new episode airs. You can also leave a comment with your thoughts on the show or a suggested topic. Thanks again, and enjoy the show. A life insurance policy is a great thing to have to ensure your family is taken care of in the event of your untimely death. The funeral cost alone can be more than many can manage. Outside of dying, you might still need an insurance policy in the event that you get injured to the point that you can no longer work and provide for your family. Whether you lose a few fingers or become completely paralyzed, a sudden accident can alter a person's life severely, and having a bit of a safety net is a smart decision. Sometimes, though, the safety net can become a landing pad. Vernon, Florida is not a place that would normally attract much attention. Located in the panhandle of Florida, about 35 miles or 56 kilometers north of Panama City, Florida and the Gulf Coast, Vernon's history has remained fairly benign outside of a specific 10-year period in the middle of the 20th century. It started as a trading post called Rosh's Bluff in the 1820s, and the name was changed in 1851. The new name was a nod to George Washington's plantation in Virginia, Mount Vernon. That was because the town was the first county seat of the newly formed Washington County. It was officially incorporated as the city of Vernon in 1926. The economic decline of Vernon, Florida began in the 1950s, transforming what had once been a reasonably prosperous community into a town struggling for survival. The small rural settlement faced a perfect storm of economic challenges that would ultimately push some residents toward desperate measures. Before its decline, Vernon had established itself as a functional economic center in Washington County. It sits on Holmes Creek, which was used as a shipping route, and the addition of a railroad in the late 1800s helped bring in more residents. By the early 1900s, Vernon was thriving with various industries in place, creating jobs and economic stability. However, the town's fortune dramatically shifted as key industries began to disappear. The local sawmill, which had provided stable employment for many residents, permanently closed its doors. That closure eliminated what had been the primary source of income for numerous families in the community. On top of that, the steamboats that once regularly passed through Vernon gradually stopped operating. Those vessels had been critical to the town's commerce, connecting Vernon to wider trade networks and supporting local businesses. Their disappearance further isolated the community. Transportation infrastructure changes compounded the problems. Despite Vernon's status in Washington County, all major railroads running through the county bypassed the town entirely. That transportation isolation effectively cut Vernon off from the economic arteries that sustained other communities in the region. As a result, Vernon found itself increasingly marginalized from regional commerce and development opportunities. The economic deterioration triggered a demographic crisis that further exacerbated Vernon's problems. Young residents, seeing little future in their hometown, began to leave en masse. Many departed for college and never returned. Others simply relocated to areas with better job prospects. That exodus of youth had profound implications. The town's population remained small, fluctuating between 500 and 800 residents. The community lost its most productive workforce segment. Local knowledge and skills disappeared with the younger generation. The tax base eroded as working-age residents departed. The combined effect of industry closures and population decline created a desperate economic situation. The town's isolation and economic hardship provided fertile ground for what would later become one of America's most shocking insurance fraud schemes. By the late 1950s, Vernon had transformed from a functional community into a place where economic desperation was palpable. That environment ultimately would set the stage for the unusual and disturbing trend that would earn the town its infamous nickname, Nub City. Insurance fraud is common in the true crime world. Money being one of the most common motives for many crimes, scamming the insurance industry to make a quick buck is a tale as old as, well, there have been insurance companies. Many times we hear stories about someone who died under mysterious circumstances, and the authorities soon discover that a large insurance policy had been recently taken out on the victim. But someone doesn't have to die in order for an insurance scam to work. Sometimes a property will be destroyed in a sudden fire, or someone will intentionally crash their car and claim they suffered an injury. There are many ways to carry out an insurance scam that doesn't involve taking a life, but sometimes that just means they only took a limb. A life insurance policy, at least in the US where this story happened, would normally pay out upon the insured's death. A medical insurance plan would pay for treatment and possibly the prosthetics needed in the event that you lose a limb in an accident. But you can also get insurance that will pay out for the loss of a limb, kind of like your limbs have their own life insurance policy. That would be an accidental death and dismemberment plan. They're usually riders that you have in your life insurance policy, and they have specific payout amounts depending on which appendage you lose and how many you're suddenly without. You would set the payout amount like you would a life insurance policy, and if you die, your beneficiary receives 100% of the payout. You could also get 100% of the payout if you lose multiple limbs, suffer significant paralysis, or if you suffer a complete loss of sight. If you lose a single limb or sight in one eye, you might get 50% of the payout. If you lose a couple of fingers, you might get 25% of the payout. Those are just examples, as the amounts depend on the insurance company and the specific injury suffered. The company will generally have a spreadsheet with the breakdown of what percentage of the total payout each appendage is worth, because that's not creepy. Most states' workers' comp insurance has similar breakdowns, as loss of a limb or one of the senses is more likely in a workplace injury. Facing dire economic circumstances, some Vernon residents resorted to this unprecedented solution that would forever mark their town in history. The desperate scheme began sometime in the 1950s. It's believed that initially, one unknown resident's successful insurance claim following a limb loss caught the attention of neighbors struggling to make ends meet. It's possible the insurance claim was for a legitimate accident, but it sparked a financial idea in someone's head. Word quickly spread throughout the tight-knit community that significant money could be made through such extreme measures. Following that first case, others began replicating the strategy, albeit with increasingly larger policies and payouts. That disturbing trend rapidly escalated, with payouts eventually reaching as much as $1 million. By the mid-1960s, an estimated 50 of Vernon's 700 residents had allegedly deliberately maimed themselves for insurance money. That notable proportion, representing over 7% of the city's population, became informally known as the Nub Club. The Florida Panhandle alone, primarily due to Vernon's activities, subsequently accounted for 2/3 of all loss of limb accident claims in the entire United States. The most prevalent method of self-mutilation involved firearms, primarily shotguns, owing to their simplicity and perceived credibility as accident causes. Essentially, residents fabricated elaborate hunting or farming mishaps to explain their injuries. Other participants opted for more controlled methods, including saws and other tools to remove limbs. Insurance agent L.W. Birdshaw recalled clients with suspicious claims. One who allegedly shot his own foot while protecting chickens, another who lost his hand while trying to shoot a hawk, and notably a man who purchased insurance and then, less than 12 hours later, shot off his foot while aiming for a squirrel. Most tellingly, participants typically sacrificed less essential body parts, like a left hand rather than a right hand, further indicating the calculated nature of those self-inflicted injuries. As insurance claims from Vernon multiplied, insurance companies grew increasingly suspicious of the tiny Florida town. The unusually high number of dismemberment claims prompted insurers to launch formal investigations that would lead them to reveal a shocking situation. The financial scale of Vernon's fraud scheme was staggering. What began with modest claims of around $5,000 quickly escalated to payouts in the hundreds of thousands, with the previously mentioned case paying out $1 million. The disproportionate concentration of claims from one small town finally convinced insurance companies that they were dealing with an organized fraud scheme rather than coincidental accidents. According to insurance investigator John Healy, that pattern was typical of insurance fraud rings. He said, quote, "One guy gets away with it and he collects. Then he tells a friend about it and he goes and does the same thing, but he takes out a bigger policy." Investigator John Healy was dispatched to Vernon by Continental National American Insurance Group after claims from the area began exceeding $100,000. That would be the equivalent of over $1 million today. His findings painted a grim picture of a community transformed by self-mutilation. Upon arriving in Vernon, Healy was immediately struck by the unsettling atmosphere. He would end up writing in his report, quote, "To sit in your car on a sweltering summer evening on the main street of Nub City, watching anywhere from 8 to a dozen cripples walking along the street gives the place a ghoulish, eerie atmosphere." Healy, who had spent 13 years investigating insurance fraud cases, declared that Vernon's situation stood out amongst the worst he had encountered. Throughout his career, he typically handled 10 or 12 cases of fraud involving homicide or suspected homicide each year and about the same number of self-injury cases. Nonetheless, what he witnessed in Vernon was unprecedented. The town was already well known in the insurance industry. Healy later said that the witness in the case that he was investigating in Vernon had already been a witness in a previous accidental dismemberment. Simultaneously, Murray Armstrong, an insurance official for Liberty National, uncovered an alarming pattern of what's called policy stacking among Vernon residents. Armstrong documented one farmer who had taken out insurance policies with 28 or 38 companies before losing his foot. Remarkably, that individual was paying premiums that cost more than his income. On the day he lost his foot, several suspicious circumstances emerged. He drove his wife's automatic transmission car instead of his usual stick-shift pickup, which would have required using his soon-to-be-missing left foot for the clutch. Moreover, authorities discovered he carried a tourniquet in his pocket, which he claimed was for, quote, "snakes in case of snakebite." Specifically, the investigators identified that approximately a dozen of Vernon's 500 residents had lost limbs during what Healy described as, quote, "a 3-year orgy of self-maiming." Despite overwhelming evidence of fraud, Vernon's insurance scammers faced virtually no legal consequences for their deliberate self-mutilation. The justice system, designed to punish wrongdoing, proved remarkably ineffective against what insurance investigators clearly identified as organized fraud. Ironically, the very extremity of the crime became its best defense. Insurance companies quickly took suspected fraudsters to court but encountered an unexpected obstacle: juror incredulity. Panels consistently refused to accept that anyone would deliberately amputate their own limbs for financial gain. Murray Armstrong would later explain in the case with the $1 million payout, quote, "It was hard to make a jury believe a man would shoot off his foot. It's possible that that was a psychological barrier that created a shield against prosecution. Another reason that the defendants were not convicted could be because the members of the community weren't willing to do so. The members of the jury would have been local residents, and if the surrounding population knew what was going on, it's entirely possible they just weren't willing to punish residents of the county." Throughout the scam's duration, not a single member of Vernon's Nub Club was ever convicted of fraud. Unable to secure convictions, insurance companies resorted to alternative measures. Initially, they dramatically increased premium rates throughout the Florida panhandle. When that failed to deter the practice, insurers took more drastic action and simply stopped writing policies in the region altogether. That industry exodus ultimately succeeded where the legal system had failed, bringing Vernon's nearly decade-long insurance fraud scheme to an end by the late 1960s. In the late 1970s, documentary filmmaker Errol Morris arrived in Vernon with a clear objective: to expose the infamous insurance fraud scheme that had earned the town its Nub City nickname. His journey would take an unexpected turn, ultimately creating a film quite different from what he had initially planned. After reading about Vernon's insurance fraud cases, Morris secured financial help from filmmaker Werner Herzog and spent nearly a year living in the community. From the outset, his investigation into the self-mutilation scheme met fierce resistance. When Morris attempted to interview a double amputee about the insurance scams, the man's son-in-law, a Marine Corps veteran, physically assaulted him. Morris later admitted, quote, "I decided that whatever I was doing was really stupid and dangerous." The hostility escalated even further when someone tried to hit his cinematographer with a truck. Evidently, Vernon's residents were determined to protect their secret. Morris received at least one death threat during his investigations. In another disturbing encounter at the Cat's Eye Tavern, a local twice the filmmaker's size smiled as he extinguished a cigarette on Morris's blazer. The self-proclaimed king of the nubbies, a holdover from Vernon's insurance fraud period, explicitly told Morris and his crew to leave town within 24 hours. That overwhelming resistance demonstrated how desperately the community wanted to bury its notorious past. Undeterred yet redirected, Morris returned in 1980 with funding from WNET and ZDF to create a completely different film. The resulting 56-minute documentary, simply titled Vernon, Florida, released in 1981, focused entirely on the town's eccentric personalities. It featured distinctive locals, including a turkey hunter obsessed with his elusive prey, a policeman without crimes to solve, and a wildlife collector. Morris employed a distinctive style with fixed camera frames showing subjects looking directly at viewers. Interestingly, some Vernon residents actually appreciated the film. The turkey hunter thought it was great, whereas others hoped it might attract tourism. The documentary ultimately preserved a unique portrait of Vernon's quirky character in the aftermath of its scandalous past. The film earned critical acclaim, including a perfect 100% score on Rotten Tomatoes. Through that unexpected shift, Morris unintentionally helped rebrand Vernon's image. Throughout the decades following the infamous insurance fraud case, Vernon, Florida has worked to distance itself from its dark past. Today, the small town presents a vastly different image than its Nub City heyday. Most current Vernon inhabitants either dismiss or minimize the town's notorious history. One resident said, quote, "Vernon is a great small town filled with the kindest people. Real salt-of-the-earth, hard-working, honest people. The story of Nub City is in their past." Another resident said, quote, "The town is still full of eccentrics. We have a guy who exclusively rides his lawnmower around town, but it's nothing like it used to be." Presently, many locals act as if the Nub Club legend was exactly that, merely a legend. Nevertheless, observant visitors still notice older residents missing limbs, silent reminders of the community's hidden story. Now focused on turkey hunting, fishing, and cultivating its quirky small-town atmosphere, Vernon has effectively buried its Nub City identity. Vernon's transformation from a desperate community driven to self-mutilation into a quiet rural town stands as one of the most bizarre chapters in American insurance fraud history. Those 50 residents who, allegedly, deliberately sacrificed limbs for financial gain forever changed the town's legacy. Their actions resulted from a perfect storm of economic devastation, isolation, and desperation that gripped this small Florida panhandle community from the 1950s to the 1960s. Remarkably, that elaborate fraud scheme succeeded largely because juries were unwilling to convict, either because they found it impossible to believe anyone would deliberately shoot their own limbs off, or because they simply didn't want to. Consequently, insurance companies resorted to their only viable option: complete withdrawal from the region, effectively ending the practice not through prosecution but through financial starvation. At the end of the day, it's impossible to say that any one of these situations wasn't an accident, as it couldn't be proven in a court of law. That said, there are only so many coincidences that can happen before you have to accept that something more sinister is going on. It's unfortunate that anyone would become so desperate that they would sacrifice a part of their body in exchange for money, but desperation can cause people to take extreme action. Fortunately, it seems as though Vernon, Florida has recovered enough that people haven't needed to resort to other crimes in order to make ends meet. It does beg the question, though: how far would you go to support yourself and your family? If you want to learn more, you can watch the documentary Vernon, Florida by Errol Morris. It's available on YouTube. Thanks so much for letting us tell you this sinister story. If you like the show, please subscribe and turn on notifications so you always know when a new episode airs. You can also hit like or leave a comment with your thoughts about the show or a suggestion for an episode. Thanks again, and we'll see you next week, where we'll take you somewhere sinister.